They don't leave with a slam of the door. They don't vanish in the drama of flames or thunder. The empath's disappearance comes like dusk falling unnoticed. Not a spectacle, but a silence. A silence that unsettles more than any scream could. You only realize what's missing when the air no longer holds that invisible current you had grown used to. For years, maybe decades, there was someone who could sit in your presence and hold the weight of your chaos without protest, someone who absorbed storms without demanding shelter for themselves. And when they finally disappear, the absence is more violent than any conflict you ever had with them. Carl Jung once wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." The empath knew this truth instinctively, often before they had words for it. They carried not only their own shadows, but also the shadows of those around them. Their presence became a mirror, a psychic net that caught what others refused to see. And when that net tears away, when the mirror turns and walks into the unknown, all that hidden weight falls back onto the very people who had unknowingly placed it there. The vanishing of an empath is not just personal loss. It is psychic rupture. Families feel it like a collapse in the foundation, though they cannot explain why the structure suddenly wobbles. Partners feel it as an emptiness no new affection can fill. Communities sense it like a sudden hollowness, as if a subtle binding force has dissolved. What is lost is not merely a person, but the quiet architecture of stability they once provided. And here lies the paradox. So long as the empath remains, their presence is taken for granted. They are the backdrop, not the centerpiece. They are the silence that allows others' voices to echo, the still water against which others measure their turbulence. But when they step away, when the stillness evaporates, the noise left behind is deafening. Think of the shadow, in Jungian terms, the aspects of ourselves we refuse to face. The empath, knowingly or not, becomes the container for those shadows. You projected your rage, your fear, your despair, and they held it like a sacred vessel. You mistook their patience for infinite strength. You mistook their silence for agreement. You mistook their love for a bottomless well. But every well has its depths. And one day, the empath realizes that they have been drowning in what was never theirs to carry. They leave not because they wish to wound, but because survival demands it. Their disappearance is the most radical act of self-preservation they can make. For those left behind, the vanishing is an earthquake. The cracks do not show on the surface immediately, but slowly the fractures spread. Conversations once cushioned by their listening ear now end in sharp edges. Conflicts once absorbed in their calm presence now spiral unchecked. You begin to notice that peace was never peace. It was their constant labor, their silent intervention. Without them, the raw truth emerges. The storm was always there, only hidden by the one who carried it. This is why their absence lingers like a wound that will not close. Because it forces a confrontation with the self. The empath's disappearance rips away illusions. Illusions of harmony, illusions of strength, illusions of love that was never whole. Their leaving becomes the mirror you cannot escape, reflecting back the dependency you denied. And so the silence of their absence becomes the loudest sound you know. You replay conversations, remember the small kindnesses, recall the times they seemed to understand you without words. And it is then you realize they were the witness to your existence. They saw you, even when you refused to see yourself. The vanishing of an empath is the most haunting of disappearances, not because of what is gone, but because of what it reveals. It is the tearing open of a truth too long buried, the truth that some people are the invisible scaffolding of our lives. And when they walk away, the collapse is inevitable. This is not the end of the story. It is only the opening wound. The beginning of the unraveling, the first taste of what it means to live without the one who held your storms. They call it patience, kindness, listening. But what the empath carries cannot be reduced to soft adjectives. It is a labor that hides in silence. It is a weight invisible to those who lean upon it, yet crushing to the one who holds it. The empath is not merely the friend who answers late-night calls, or the partner who absorbs the storm of another's anger, or the child who grows up translating the moods of unstable parents. The empath is the hidden architecture of relationships, the scaffolding no one notices until it collapses. Carl Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But empaths are transformed disproportionately. They don't simply react, they absorb. They metabolize the unspoken sorrows of others, carrying fragments of despair that were never theirs to begin with. Families unknowingly orbit around them. Lovers mistake their containment for devotion. Communities lean on their quietness as if silence were an infinite well. And yet, all the while, the empath bends beneath the pressure of sustaining what was never evenly shared. Nietzsche once reflected, "To live is to suffer. To survive is to find some meaning in the suffering." The empath becomes the translator of that meaning, taking the raw chaos of others' pain and reframing it into something survivable. But in doing so, they carry a double burden: the original suffering of the world and the exhausting responsibility of giving it meaning. Psychologists describe trauma as something that is not just experienced but transmitted. The empath becomes the carrier, the vessel, the silent bridge across which unhealed wounds are passed down. In this way, entire family legacies rest on their shoulders. The father's rage, the mother's grief, the sibling's self-destruction, all of it finds a hidden sanctuary in the empath's body. But when this hidden architecture is removed, what happens? Houses collapse, relationships unravel, communities fracture. The empath's weight is revealed in absence, a silence that exposes just how much was always being carried, invisibly, by one person. And here lies the cruel paradox. The empath's disappearance feels like betrayal when in truth it is revelation. It shows others the depth of their own dependency, the scaffolding they never acknowledged, the quiet sacrifices that made their lives appear stable. What society calls strength in an empath is not strength at all, but overextension. It is survival purchased at the cost of self-erasure. And so when they finally step away, the world does not simply lose a friend, a partner, a child. It loses the very ground it stood upon without ever realizing it. The empath was the unseen weight-bearer. And without them, the structure trembles. At first, it looks like nothing has changed. Life continues with its routines. Dinners are cooked, meetings are attended, conversations still occur. But beneath the surface, the seams are beginning to tear. What once held everything together is no longer there. The absence of the empath is not immediate chaos. It is a slow unraveling. A silence that begins to echo. A stillness that reveals cracks previously hidden by their constant mending. Carl Jung wrote of projection, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But without the empath as a buffer, projection no longer goes unnoticed. The rage once safely absorbed now lashes outward. The insecurities once gently soothed now consume the people who hold them. What the empath once carried privately is released, raw and unfiltered, into the open. Families that once seemed united splinter into factions. Old grievances, long buried under the empath's mediation, rise to the surface. Parents clash, siblings turn cold, partners find themselves face to face with the parts of each other they had always outsourced to the empath's patience. In relationships, the collapse is even sharper. The partner who relied on endless emotional containment suddenly confronts a mirror. The breakdowns that once found comfort in gentle arms now feel unbearable in their own body. And here comes the desperate revelation. It was never stability they had. It was dependency disguised as love. Jung also spoke of transference, the unconscious redirection of feelings onto another. For years, people had transferred their wounds, their shame, their longing onto the empath, mistaking this one-sided transaction for connection. But when the empath walks away, that transference snaps back like a whip. The weight of unprocessed emotion returns to its origin, and most cannot bear it. The unraveling is not just personal, it is systemic. Communities lose their quiet center, the person who bridged conflict without recognition. Workplaces fracture when the one who silently kept harmony departs. Friend groups collapse when the hidden mediator is no longer there to hold the threads. Recognition comes too late. It arrives as anger. How could you leave? It arrives as desperation. Please come back, I need you. It arrives as bitterness. You were never who I thought you were. But underneath all these cries lies the same unspoken truth: without you, I don't know who I am. And this is the final cruelty. The empath's gift was always mistaken for permanence. Others believed it was infinite, an inexhaustible well. They never imagined it could dry up, or that the one who gave so much might one day refuse. The unraveling reveals a harsh reality, that what many called love was in fact dependence. That what looked like stability was scaffolding. That what seemed eternal was, all along, a fragile balance maintained by one soul, quietly breaking under the weight of many. And when that soul departs, the unraveling begins. There are losses we learn to live with. Time softens their edges. Distance numbs their sting. But the loss of an empath is not one of them. It lingers, like a wound that refuses to close. You see, the empath does not simply leave a role. They leave a presence. And their presence is unlike any other. They are the rare ones who see you not just for who you are on the surface, but for who you are beneath. The fragile, hidden self you barely acknowledge even to yourself. When they walk away, it is not merely companionship that is lost, it is recognition, and recognition is irreplaceable. Attachment theory tells us that humans are wired to seek a secure base, someone in whose gaze we feel whole, someone who assures us that we exist, that we are seen. For many, the empath becomes that base, not because they promised it, not because they declared it, but because they lived it, quietly, through every moment of listening, every silent act of holding space. And so their absence is not just the end of a relationship. It is a rupture in the psyche. The ground that once felt stable collapses. The echo that once answered your silence is gone. What remains is an emptiness that words cannot touch. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." The empath's presence softened this terror. They stood beside you as you brushed against the edges of your shadow. They bore it, held it, translated it into something you could survive. Without them, you face yourself alone, raw, unmediated, unbearable. This is why the cut does not heal. It is not only grief. It is not only longing. It is the sudden confrontation with what the empath once shielded you from, yourself. Partners describe it as an ache that no new love can soothe. Families speak of the silence that never fills, no matter how much noise they pour into it. Communities sense the fracture long after they stop naming it. The cut embeds itself not in the skin, but in the soul. And perhaps the cruelest truth of all, the empath never leaves with anger. They leave with quiet. They slip away not with accusation, but with exhaustion. And that silence, that refusal to explain, to justify, to give closure, cuts deeper than words ever could. For how do you heal from someone who never harmed you, but simply stopped carrying you? How do you replace the one who gave you a mirror and then shattered it by stepping away? You don't. The cut becomes a part of you. A scar not of violence, but of absence. A reminder of the person who once made you whole by reflecting the self you refused to see. And though time will layer over it, though life will distract you with other connections, other voices, other hands, the wound remains. It remains because it is not just about losing them. It is about losing the version of yourself that only existed in their gaze. That is why the loss of the empath is the cut you never heal from. They called it a gift, but it was never freely given. The empath does not choose their role as the healer. The role chooses them, carved into their skin by old wounds and silent scars. Carl Jung once spoke of the archetype of the wounded healer, The paradox that it is those most broken who are compelled to mend others. The empath fits this image perfectly. Their tenderness is not the product of an untouched life, but the fruit of surviving devastation. They know what it means to drown, and so they learn the subtle art of pulling others to shore. But healing, in this world, is a transaction rarely balanced. Like the myth of Chiron, the centaur who could heal all wounds but never cure his own, the empath carries a private agony beneath the surface. Their service to others becomes both their blessing and their slow undoing. Society thrives on them. Families remain intact, friendships endure, even entire communities hold together, because someone is willing to absorb the poison, to metabolize the pain no one else will face. And yet, what is the fate of the one who becomes indispensable? The philosopher Kierkegaard wrote of despair as the sickness unto death, the gnawing sense of never being one's true self. For the empath, despair hides behind the smile, the reassuring nod, the soothing words offered to another. Every act of comfort takes them further from themselves, further from the inner life that longs for recognition. Nietzsche's warning, that he who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster, lingers here in a different form. The empath fights against the suffering of others but risks becoming nothing more than the vessel for everyone else's darkness. The tragedy is that their healing is rarely acknowledged as sacrifice. To those they help it seems effortless, natural, as though the empath was born solely to absorb pain. Few pause to ask, at what cost? Like Prometheus stealing fire from the gods to gift humanity, the empath brings light, warmth, and survival. But Prometheus was chained for his generosity. So too, the empath pays, though their chains are invisible. Exhaustion, loneliness, disconnection from their own needs. And so, one day, they withdraw. Not from cruelty, but from necessity. In the healer recognizes that their own survival requires retreat, silence, disappearance. Their vanishing is not betrayal, but the only act of fidelity left. Fidelity to their own fractured soul. This is the paradox of the healer. They save others by giving away the very life they cannot seem to save for themselves. And when they disappear, the rupture feels mythic, as though the world has lost not just a person but a lifeline to something greater. Their absence echoes like a wound in history, a reminder that even those who mend cannot endlessly endure. The world is louder than it has ever been, not with music, not with laughter, but with a constant hum of demands that never end. Notifications, advertisements, headlines, voices, each one insisting, look here, feel this, react now. In this endless storm of noise, empathy becomes a currency that is drained faster than it can be replenished. The empath, once a sanctuary of quiet presence, finds themselves besieged on all sides. Jung wrote that modern man suffers not from too little, but from too much. Too much stimulation, too many demands upon the psyche. And it is here that the empath suffers most. For them, every vibration of the world is felt in the body. Every cry registers as a wound. What others can tune out, they cannot ignore. To live as an empath in this digital age is to be porous in a world designed to pierce. Corporations know this. They have learned to manipulate empathy to turn care into commodity. Customer care, wellness branding, relatable marketing. The language of compassion is borrowed, repackaged, and sold back to us until even sincerity feels mass-produced. Social media thrives on emotional exposure, demanding not only your attention but your heart. To scroll is to be pulled into endless streams of other people's grief, outrage, and need. For most, it is exhausting. For the empath, it is unbearable. Here lies the cruel irony. The very trait that once made the empath invaluable is now exploited. They are pulled in 1,000 directions, asked to hold strangers they will never meet, pressured to care endlessly in a world that rarely returns the gesture. And so the empath retreats, and not from love, not from responsibility, but from survival itself. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han once described our era as the burnout society, where even the act of caring becomes labor, and the self collapses under the weight of endless responsibility. The empath embodies this collapse most acutely. They cannot compete with the velocity of demands, cannot give endlessly to a machine that never sleeps. What once was a gift now becomes a liability. This is why their disappearance is not selfishness. It is protection, a final shield erected between their soul and the machinery of the world. The empath steps away because they must. Their silence is the only way to reclaim themselves from a culture that would devour every last ounce of their compassion. When they vanish, it exposes a truth few want to admit. We have built a world where genuine empathy cannot survive without retreat. Their absence is not just personal, it is cultural. It is a mirror held up to society, showing us that our noise has drowned out the very thing we most hunger for, real human presence. And so, their silence becomes protest, not shouted, not written, but lived. In their withdrawal, the empath tells the world, "Your noise cannot claim me anymore." There comes a moment when the empath can no longer live as a mirror for others. For years, their identity was constructed in fragments: the sorrow of a partner, the rage of a parent, the despair of a friend. They became a collage of borrowed emotions, so practiced in holding others that they forgot the weight of their own soul. But when they step away, something extraordinary begins. This disappearance is not abandonment. It is transformation. Jung called it individuation, the slow, painful process of turning toward the self, of becoming whole rather than a fragment of what others need. For the empath, this means peeling away the layers of borrowed pain, confronting the silence that once terrified them, and asking, "Who am I when I'm no longer carrying everyone else?" At first, the answer is emptiness. The silence feels unbearable. Without the noise of others, they feel invisible, almost unreal. But gradually, the emptiness begins to shift. It reveals itself not as absence, but as space, the fertile ground, in which something new can grow. In solitude, the empath meets the child they once were, the wounds they once ignored, the dreams they once buried under the weight of others. Here, healing begins. Not the kind of healing that makes them endlessly available again, but the deeper healing that teaches boundaries, discernment, and strength. They learn that love does not mean self-erasure, that compassion does not demand martyrdom. They realize, perhaps for the first time, that their life is not a vessel for others' storms but a landscape with its own horizons. Philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote, "The most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have." For the empath, this future is the one they sacrifice to keep others alive. In returning to themselves, they grieve the years they gave away. But grief slowly transforms into gratitude. Gratitude that there is still time to live differently, to belong first to themselves. This is the rebirth. The empath ceases to be a ghost wandering in the lives of others and becomes flesh within their own. They begin to write their story not as a background character, but as a protagonist. Individuation is not a withdrawal from humanity, but a deeper contribution to it. For only when the empath has become whole can their presence carry the weight of truth rather than the burden of sacrifice. And yet, for those left behind, this transformation feels like betrayal. They see only the loss, not the rebirth. They do not understand that the empath has not abandoned them but has finally returned, not to them, but to themselves. This is why the empath's disappearance remains unforgettable. Because while others mourn the silence, the empath is learning to speak at last in their own voice. It always ends in silence. Not the silence of indifference, nor the silence of absence, but a silence that weighs heavier than words, heavier than grief itself. When the empath is gone, the world does not explode. It does not fall apart in fire or thunder. It simply goes quiet. And that quietness unsettles more than any storm ever could. Because silence, unlike noise, forces us to listen. It strips away the distractions and leaves us with ourselves. When the empath disappears, what is left is not only their absence but the mirror they once held. Suddenly, every unspoken word, Every ignored wound, every shadow we projected onto them comes, rushing back. There is no one left to absorb it, no one left to soften it. Only us, confronted by the truth we never wanted to face. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The empath's silence is that confrontation. Their absence turns the unconscious into something we can no longer escape. For years, they carried what we refused to carry. Now, in the vacuum of their withdrawal, the weight returns to us, and we realize how much of our survival rested on an unseen sacrifice. This is why the wound never heals. It is not simply grief for a person. It is grief for the part of ourselves we only ever knew through them. The way they saw us when we were invisible. The way they believed in us when we were broken. The way their quiet presence held together the fractures we didn't admit we had. Their disappearance is not just loss, it is exposure. A revelation that we were always leaning on borrowed strength. In the silence, there is also a lesson. A brutal, tender lesson. To notice those who carry us before they are gone. To honor the invisible work of empathy before it withdraws. To understand that what feels endless is always finite. The empath does not vanish to punish. They vanish because no one can bleed endlessly and still remain whole, and so the silence becomes an invitation. For those who remain, it asks, who will you become without the one who carried you? Will you collapse into bitterness, or will you finally learn to face the shadows you once avoided? Will you seek another mirror, or will you dare to meet yourself? In the end, the empath's silence is both a death and a birth. A death for those who lost the sanctuary they never valued. A birth for the empath, who at last belongs to themselves. And the final truth is this: silence is never empty. It is full of all the words we never said, all the gratitude we never voiced, all the love we thought we had infinite time to give. When the one who heard your silence is gone, the question that remains is, who will you become in theirs?